Welcome to the Flex Rental Solutions webinar. Today we're going to continue our discussion on numbering schemes, but today we're going to focus on the numbering schemes of our project elements. So our project elements being like our quotes, invoices, pull sheets, POs, etc. So the first place I wanted to look, if you didn't see what I did there, on the projects and then project elements screen, let's look at one of our project elements, the quote, and then we're going to see where the numbering scheme is assigned. That's here on the numbering tab. And you can see that right now the settings are, the quotes are individually numbered, yes. If you were to set this to no, anytime you create a new quote, it just wouldn't have a number at all. You would only search for the quotes by name instead of having the option to search by number too. The document number caption is when this will show, like for example, I believe this shows on your email templates. This will say quote number and then followed by the numbering scheme. And right now it's set to 4-digit sequential by year. And in just a second we'll go and look at what that is exactly. The document number is not being inherited from anywhere else, and this is the current sequential sequence. So if I were to create a new quote right now, let's just call this numbering test 1. Then you'll see that the sequence has gone one above what the current sequence was. So it was 16, now it's up to 17. And you can look at the numbering scheme that's set for any of your elements. So for example, let's look at the pull sheet. Oh, my apologies. Here's the screen share. And let me go back and just show you where I was. So it was the projects menu, project elements. Is everyone seeing the screen now? I apologize, I just forgot to unpause it. And then we went to the numbering tab of whichever project element that we opened. And that's where these the things that you heard me talking about, that's where those options are here. And then I was just going to open the pull sheet project element and look at the numbering scheme that's assigned to the pull sheet. So we'll go to the numbering tab. We see that this one's set up as a 5-digit random. So if we go back to that quote that we had just created, and remember this was set up as a 4-digit sequential by year, so you'll see 15 for 2015 and then 4 digits. But if I create a pull sheet, even though this is going to be a child of the quote, since there weren't any inherit settings set up on the pull sheet, it's going to populate its own document number. So if we click on edit header of the pull sheet, you can see that it created a 5-digit random, which is what the pull sheet was set up as. So let's look at these different numbering schemes. This is on the system settings menu, then numbering schemes. The first one we were looking at was for the quote, the 4-digit sequential by year. Let's double click on that and see what its settings are. So you can see its name. The scheme is just sequential by year. The sequencing from a common pool we'll look at in just a minute when we look at our purchase POs and rental POs. It doesn't have a prefix, but we talked a little bit about this on our last webinar if you were here, that you can put a prefix, like for example, maybe you want to do something like an abbreviation for quote, and then have a prefix separator. So the number would be QT dash, and then in this case it would be 15 for the year, and then dash a 4-digit sequential number. Most people don't need the custom prefix for that. You'll see that, for example, if you look at our numbering scheme for a subrental, that has the custom prefix built in. Same with our, I believe, the invoice scheme has an invoice custom prefix, just so that you can know straight off that that's an invoice. But of course, you can edit and change this any way that you want. So that's what the 4-digit sequential by year looks like. If we look at the 5-digit random, which is what the pull sheet was using, you can see that the basic scheme is just cryptographically random. There's no custom prefix or year, and the maximum digits is 5. And of course, just like we talked about in the webinar last week, you can create a new scheme. And we'll show an example of why you might do that for your project elements a little bit later on in this webinar. The first thing that I want to show, and we get this question a lot, is how can you have a child element inherit the document number of its parent? So for example, let's go back to this quote, and before we do that, let's delete this pull sheet, because in this example we want the pull sheet to inherit the document number of the quote. So what we're going to do is go back to Projects, Project Elements. We'll double click on Pull Sheet and go to the Numbering tab of the pull sheet. And we're going to set this to Manual. And then we're going to say Document Number Inherited as Yes. Just so you know, if this were set to No and the numbering scheme was manual, then anytime that you create a new pull sheet, it's not going to assign it a number. It will say something like unassigned in parentheses. And that just means that you have to give it a document number yourself manually. But if this is set to document number inherited yes, then it's going to inherit the document number of its parent. So let's go back and generate a pull sheet again for this quote. And this time the pull sheet should inherit the document number of the quote. So let's look at the edit header. And you can see that the pull sheet number is the same as the number of the quote. A lot of people like to do this just so that they can keep all of the documents that are associated with one quote or event the same. And there is something, we've been getting a few questions about this lately, but we're working on, for a future release, the functionality where you can more easily, for child documents, have the same document number, but then add a -1, a -2, -3, etc. A lot of people want to use that, for example, if they have an event folder. Every quote that they create, they want to have the same document number, but each version of the quote or each different quote that they have, they want it to have a -1, -2, -3. So that's something that we're working on that will be available in the future. But for now, if you want to do something like that, then you'll just have to open the element, go to Edit Header, and you can manually change the number if you want. So that's how you can get a child element to inherit the number of the parent. A lot of people will do this for all of the child elements that go down from the quote. So for example, you would go back to Projects, Project Elements, and Invoice, and set up the same scheme that we just did for the pull sheet, but this time for the invoice. So you would go to the Numbering tab, you would say that it is Manual and Document Inherited to Yes. But right now let's look at the numbering scheme that the invoice is using. It's Invoice Scheme 1. So let's go back to our numbering schemes and look at Invoice Scheme 1. And right now, even though we would create an invoice as a child to the quote, it would still take on the attributes of Invoice Scheme 1. So it's only going to be sequential. We're not going to deal with a year here. It's going to have a custom prefix of INV, then a dash, and then 5 digits. So if we go back to the quote, where was that? And we'll probably have to put an inventory item on there to be able to generate an invoice. Just give it a quick price. And I should also mention that what we've been looking at so far, I believe, is how Flex is set up by default when we send it to a new customer. And so the original pull sheet numbering scheme of 5-digit random, that's the default. We set it up to do manual. You'll have to set that up if you're a new customer and haven't set that up already. So we created that invoice, and now as you can see, it is taking on the invoice numbering scheme, even though we created it as a child to the quote, because it's not set up to inherit anything from the quote. And again, just to drill in that point, if you want it to inherit the exact number, you have to switch to manual first, and then say document number inherited yes. Let's look really quick, just to wrap up here, at the sequence from a common pool that I said we would look at earlier. So we're just back on the numbering schemes tab here. Again, that was on system settings and numbering schemes. And let's look at our PPO and RPO numbering schemes. These are both set up as just a sequential with a max digit of 5. So let's open the RPO as well. There's no year, it's just a sequential with a max digit 5. Right now, the sequence from a common pool is not turned on, but let's turn that on and see what happens. So I'm going to turn that on for the PPO and for the RPO. Okay, so now let's go to projects, project elements, and open the purchase PO. And then we're going to go to the numbering tab, just like we have been for the other elements. You can see that it is currently set to the PPO sequential, and the current sequence is at 8. So what we're going to want to do is go back to the project elements and look at the rental PO as well, and set the current sequence to the same as the purchase PO. And that was 8. Oops, I accidentally closed that. Let me reopen that. So basically what's going to happen here is that whenever we create a purchase PO and whenever we create a rental PO, it's going to use the sequence from the common pool between those two elements. Let's set that to 8. So let's create a new purchase PO first. We'll just call this numbering test 3. And we can see that the document number that was created is PPO 00009. Now let's create a rental PO. And even though we had the rental PO current sequence set at 8, since this is sequencing from the same pool, it's going up in accordance to the other numbering scheme. I did some earlier testing and I already had a 00010 in the system, so that's why it jumped up to the 11. And so this is just useful for common or similar elements like the rental PO or the purchase PO that you want to have basically the same numbering scheme. It's going to have the different prefix, so RPO versus PPO, but will more or less follow the same numbering sequence. So that's what sequencing from the common pool will do. I'm going to go ahead and set that back to no, just so I don't forget to do that afterwards. The last thing we want to do is just create a new numbering scheme. And in this example, let's do one for pull sheets. So let's just call it the pull sheet scheme. And this could be anything you want, sequential by year or just sequential. Let's try just sequential. We won't do it from a common pool, and let's give it a prefix of PS. We don't need the year because this isn't sequential by year. And you can give it a prefix separator. If I don't give it a separator, then it would just say PS immediately followed by 4 digits. But I could give it a dash, I could give it a slash, or a period. Let's give it a period this time, and let's keep it at just 4 digits. So now if we go back to our project elements, open the pull sheet, and let's assign the new pull sheet. And maybe, did I save that properly? I might have to close this down and reopen it for it to pull the new data that I just created. So we open the project element settings for the pull sheet. We'll go to the numbering tab. And now we have the pull sheet scheme. We'll set the inherit to no. And this time let's just create a pull sheet from scratch, not as a child to the quote. And it doesn't matter if you do it from scratch or if you're creating it from a quote, it will still inherit the same pull sheet numbering scheme that we just set up. So you can see now we have PS, dot, and then 4 digits. So those are numbering schemes for your project elements. If you have any questions about these, we invite you to our forum and look in the webinars board and find the webinar topic for today. If you want to discuss this further, or if you have any questions or you want to get some ideas from other customers, that's a great place to go. And if you have any technical questions, then please email support@flexrentalsolutions.com.